The day her divorce papers were finalized, she didn't cry.
She didn't hesitate.
Instead, she quietly booked a one-way high-speed train ticket back to her hometown. All that remained of her former life fit neatly into a small handbag, a phone, an ID, and a bank card with a balance so limited it was almost laughable. Years of devotion, of compromise, of waiting for what? Nothing but emptiness now. The butler called her as she waited for the train. His voice was cautious, as if trying not to disturb a fragile glass about to shatter. "Madam, you still have some personal belongings at the estate. Shall I arrange to have them sent over?" "No," she answered coldly, her tone flat. "Throw them away. I don't need them anymore." There was a brief silence before he spoke again. "The little master. He's been crying. He's asking for his mother." A bitter smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "He'll have a new mother soon, the one he's always preferred anyway. My son takes after his father, even in the women they love." She exhaled softly, as if releasing years of pent-up sadness into the thin air. "I used to wonder why it couldn't have been me. But now if he doesn't love me, then so be it." The announcement echoed through the station, signaling that the train was about to depart. She glanced at the crowd boarding, her voice steady as she delivered her final words over the phone. "Tell him not to worry. I won't ever bother him again. Not in this lifetime." And with that, she powered off her phone and removed the SIM card. The ties to that city of marriage, the betrayal, the heartbreak all severed in one quiet, irreversible moment. She boarded the train, slipping into her seat as if stepping into a new life. Next to her sat a little girl, perhaps the same age as her son. The child's round eyes observed her cautiously, as though sensing the heavy storm that still lingered in the woman's chest. Once, she had adored children. Their laughter, their innocence, their simple joy. But not anymore. The girl, well-behaved and quiet, sat with folded hands. It was her guardian who disrupted the calm, barking into the phone with curses that sliced through the silence of the train car. The woman slipped on her headphones, closing her eyes. She sought the refuge of sleep, if only for a little while. Time blurred into an indistinct haze until a gentle tug on her sleeve pulled her back. She opened her eyes and found the little girl standing there, her lips trembling, her voice barely a whisper. "Auntie, my mom is gone. Can you help me find her?" The seat beside the girl was empty. Instinct overrode exhaustion. Without a second thought, she summoned the train conductor and the onboard police. As they conducted their investigation, a disturbing truth unraveled. The girl's mother had disembarked at a previous station alone. Witnesses had seen her casting wary glances behind as she walked away, careful to ensure the child didn't follow. Abandonment. The word itself was cruel, but reality was even crueler. The train car buzzed with murmurs and judgmental whispers. Passengers exchanged sharp words, condemning the mother's heartlessness, calling her child pitiful, all within earshot of the girl. Yet the child sat frozen in her seat, silent, motionless. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stared ahead with wide, empty eyes that seemed far too old for her small frame. The woman felt something stir inside, hair off flicker of something she thought was long extinguished. She hesitated only for a moment before turning to the authorities. Handing them her ID, she gave her home address and contact details. There were no elaborate plans, no second guesses. Only a quiet resolve. When the train pulled into her hometown station, she stepped off carrying the same few belongings. Her phone, her ID, her bank card, and now, unexpectedly, a little girl holding her hand. Julia and Lawrence had once walked the same campus grounds, two people tethered together not by choice but by circumstance. Occasionally, he would bring her small packages from his elder's seasonal gifts, simple necessities under the guise of family courtesy. Those brief encounters stitched them into a casual familiarity. They were never close, just two acquaintances orbiting the same university halls. Over time, whispers of Lawrence's love story with his childhood sweetheart floated through the campus air, painting a vivid picture of their romance, sweet yet stormy, an endless cycle of passion, arguments, breakups, and reconciliations. Julia remained a distant observer, her heart oddly hollow as she watched from the sidelines. Sometimes she would wonder if she envied them or merely felt adrift in her own quiet solitude. During her junior year, Julia started an internship far from campus. The daily commute was grueling, stretching her thin with exhaustion. One evening, she ran into Lawrence unexpectedly. His tone was casual, his question simple. "How have you been?" For reasons she couldn't explain, she answered truthfully, perhaps craving, in that moment, a sliver of human connection. Days later, Lawrence's grandmother called, her voice kind and concerned. She had arranged for Julia to stay in an empty house conveniently close to her company, urging her to accept. Julia tried to refuse, but gratitude ultimately overpowered her hesitation. After moving in, the house whispered of Lawrence's presence. Every corner carried traces of him, his books, his scattered belongings, his scent lingering faintly in the air. Guilty for intruding on his space, Julia quietly packed her own things into the guest room, shrinking her existence to avoid drawing attention. But the illusion of distance shattered one rainy night. Exhausted after another long shift, she returned to find Lawrence sprawled across the living room couch, drunk and unconscious. She froze, her instincts pulling her in two directions: stay distant to avoid suspicion, or protect him from the cold seeping through the walls. Compassion won. She fetched a blanket, draping it gently over his slumped form. As the fabric settled, his eyes fluttered open, hazy and unfocused. For a fleeting moment, Julia braced for him to question her presence, to lash out. But instead, in his drunken stupor, he reached out, pulling her down beside him. What followed was a mistake one neither of them would speak of again. The memory of that night blurred with time. Julia often wondered if her mind had intentionally buried it, a defense mechanism against the sting of humiliation. In her entire life, there had only been one man, one night, and even then, he hadn't called her name. He had whispered someone else's. The only time Lawrence had ever spoken her name was on the day they first met. He had glanced her up and down outside the train station, his voice indifferent as he confirmed, "Julia?" "Yes," she had replied softly. If only life had frozen at that moment, before hearts tangled and mistakes unfolded, how peaceful it would have been. How merciful. The hallway after school was eerily quiet, bathed in the soft green hue of trees swaying outside the windows. Julia and Lawrence stood opposite each other, suspended in the silence. "Didn't you want to talk privately?" Lawrence prompted, his voice cool. "Say what you need to say." Julia inhaled, steadying herself. "What have you been telling Benjamin these past years?" Lawrence frowned.
What?
"We've been divorced for 4 years. In all that time, I've kept my promise. I haven't shown up. I've sent child support every single month, directly to your account. Children's memories don't last long. Ben never liked me as his mother. If someone hadn't been constantly feeding him stories, he wouldn't even remember me, let alone long for me." Lawrence shifted his gaze. "I haven't told him anything," he said defensively. "It's his grandmother. She keeps reminding him." Julia's lips curved into a bitter smile. "Then why transfer him here?" "He insisted," Lawrence admitted, pausing. "I couldn't stop him. Of course. Benjamin adored, spoiled heir of the Jiang family, always got what he wanted." Even Lawrence's so-called principles melted in the face of his son's demands. Julia lowered her eyes, letting the weight of unspoken years settle between them. After a long pause, she exhaled.
Fine.
"Let him stay. Sooner or later, his fantasy will break. Once he realizes who I truly am, he'll want to go back. I've never been the kind of person anyone likes for long. Once he spends enough time with me, he'll see through the illusion. I'll always be the annoying, shameful biological mother who drags down his status." Her voice was steady, but somewhere deep inside, something twisted painfully. Back in her hometown, Julia opened a modest restaurant, small, simple, barely 100 square meters. She limited the number of guests, unable to handle large crowds on her own. Yet, word of her food spread like ripples across a lake. Tourists began to find their way there, turning the humble eatery into a local gem. The 18-year-old Julia had once dreamed of earning millions, building a tech empire, studying computer science to carve out a dazzling career. But the 28-year-old Julia had long abandoned those ambitions. Now, all she craved was peace, a quiet corner of the world where she could breathe. After Benjamin's school transfer, a driver brought him to her restaurant every afternoon. At first, the boy clung stubbornly to his entitled ways, pouting and demanding. But over time, his spoiled edge dulled. Lawrence rarely appeared. Most days, it was only Benjamin and the silent driver. Julia often wondered what the Jiang family was thinking, how they could claim to value Benjamin so much, yet send him here, far from their gilded world, entrusting him to a woman they had cast aside. Yet she never turned him away. He was, after all, the only blood relative she had left. She had once nursed him through sleepless nights when high fevers burned his tiny body. She had crafted toys for him by hand, even injuring herself in the process. She had done everything without expectation, without conditions. But people are selfish by nature. No matter how pure her intentions, a small part of her yearned for recognition, for warmth in return. Instead, she received only his coldness, his contempt, his aversion. It hurt more than she allowed herself to admit. Once, Benjamin had clung to her. He couldn't fall asleep without her by his side, couldn't take a single step outside without her arms carrying him. She had endured countless icy stares and whispered insults from the Jiang family, drawing strength from her son's innocent reliance on her. But as he grew, learned to walk, learned to say no, that fragile attachment unraveled. She had scolded him when necessary, set boundaries, denied him sweets, disciplined him when he misbehaved. To a child, such rules felt like cruelty. He didn't understand right from wrong, only that she restricted him, while others offered indulgence. And so, predictably, he began to pull away. Until one day, after an outing with Lawrence, Benjamin returned home and declared in his tiny, self-assured voice, "I don't want you to be my mom anymore. I want Aunt Miranda to be my mom. You don't deserve to be my mom.
Get out."
This is my house." One evening, as the quiet hum of the restaurant faded into the early dusk, Feli approached Julia with a seriousness far beyond her years. Her voice was soft, yet every word struck deep. "Mom, can I not be friends with Benjamin?" Julia glanced at her, surprised by the request. "Of course you don't have to, sweetheart. But why don't you like him?" Feli rarely showed clear dislike for anyone. She was always composed, often indifferent to the petty squabbles of others. But this time, she didn't hesitate. "Because he hurt you," Feli answered calmly, her gaze unwavering. "Every time you see him, you're sad. And he knows it. But he keeps showing up anyway." Julia's breath caught. She hadn't realized how much Feli had observed, how deeply she understood. Feli lowered her head, her tiny hands clenched. "Mom, can I hit him?" she asked earnestly. "I can't fight the adults yet, but I can fight Benjamin." The innocence in her offer was heartbreaking, almost tender in its fierce protectiveness. After a moment's pause, she added, "Mom, can you let me learn martial arts? I want to become strong. I want to protect you." Julia's heart ached at the purity of her daughter's love. She smiled gently and agreed. From that day forward, Feli threw herself into training with an intensity that even her instructor admired. "Your Feli is tougher than most of my older students," the teacher remarked proudly. Julia often thought back to Lawrence's cold, cutting words that had once pierced her like knives. "Who would love a woman like you?" But he was wrong. Her grandmother had loved her. Feli loved her. And now, perhaps most importantly, she was learning to love herself. Lawrence still appeared from time to time, like a restless ghost from a past she no longer wished to acknowledge. He would sit quietly in her restaurant, order a few simple dishes, eat without a word, and then leave with Benjamin. The neighbors, unaware of their history, whispered curiously, "Is that man courting you?" they'd ask, eyes sparkling with gossip. Julia always laughed it off. "He's not blind. she replied playfully. Why would a man like him be interested in someone like me? He's only here to pick up the boy. Once, she might have wasted countless sleepless nights wondering what Lawrence was thinking. Now, she couldn't bring herself to care. His presence no longer disturbed the fragile peace she had fought so hard to build. Still, Julia often wondered when Benjamin would finally tire of his little game of chasing after a mother's affection he had long rejected. He had lived in this small town for nearly 3 months now. No grand aquarium, no amusement parks, no luxury malls, just quiet streets and a modest life. But the colder she remained, the more desperately he clung to her. When she gently held Feli's hand, when she adjusted Feli's dress with tender care, when she brought out a special dessert just for Feli, Benjamin's eyes would cloud briefly with something that resembled loneliness. Yet every time their eyes met, his sadness would vanish, replaced by a practiced, sugary smile. Once, any sign of his pain would have shattered her heart. But now she felt nothing. She wondered why he still hadn't left. His presence was simply exhausting. She didn't hate him. She simply didn't love him anymore. The arrival of early summer marked the beginning of the long school break. On the day of the closing ceremony, Julia opened her restaurant as usual. As night fell, Benjamin was nowhere to be seen. She assumed, with some relief, that he had finally tired of the charade and returned to his privileged life. But when she returned home, she found him sitting obediently on the steps of the courtyard, holding a small, delicate cake box. Lawrence stood beside him, his arms filled with gift bags. The two of them, father and son, with their striking looks and expensive clothes, drew curious glances from passers-by, though they seemed oblivious to the attention. "Daddy, when will Mommy come back?" Benjamin asked in a hopeful whisper. "Soon," Lawrence reassured him. "We brought so many gifts to celebrate her birthday. She'll be happy." Benjamin's face lit up with excitement, though beads of sweat dotted his forehead, perhaps from the summer heat, or perhaps from anxious anticipation. Julia stopped at a distance, watching them quietly. But Feli didn't hesitate. She marched straight over, her voice clear and unwavering. "You're mistaken. Mommy's birthday isn't today." For the first time, Benjamin confronted Feli directly, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You're lying," he snapped, his voice rising. "Mommy's birthday is today. We share the same birthday." "I wouldn't get it wrong." Lawrence's eyes met Julia's as he stood up. "Julia, happy birthday," he said awkwardly, as if choking on the words. Julia approached, unlocking the courtyard gate with calm precision. "I forgot to mention," she said coolly, "I've changed my birthday." She paused, her eyes meeting his with cold indifference. "But I suppose details like that shouldn't matter to you anymore, should they? There was a time when birthdays had once been sacred. Julia's grandmother had cherished every single one, turning their small house into a haven of warmth and celebration. A homemade feast, a beautiful cake, a thoughtful gift. It was always just the two of them, yet never lonely. Even after Julia left for university, her grandmother would travel each year to be with her, bringing the same comfort and tradition, making sure Julia never celebrated alone. But everything changed during that final birthday. Julia was heavily pregnant with Benjamin, but she concealed her discomforts to keep her grandmother from worrying. She smiled and lied, saying Lawrence was loving and attentive. In truth, Lawrence barely acknowledged her presence, their marriage nothing more than a hollow arrangement. She had naively thought that what happened between them had been an accidental drunken mistake that she could quietly leave behind. But instead of fading away, that night had spiraled into a chain of events she could never escape. Before she could summon the courage to leave, Lawrence's grandmother arrived unexpectedly, bringing homemade chicken soup after hearing how hard Julia had been working. And just like that, everything unraveled. The Jiang family's matriarch wasn't interested in youthful love triangles or romantic complications. She didn't care whether Lawrence loved Julia, whether the Jiang family approved, or whether Julia herself even wanted to marry Lawrence. All she cared about was shielding Julia from public shame and protecting her fragile, aging grandmother. Julia, "I've told your grandmother everything," she had said gently. "You don't want her to worry, do you? I can see that you care for Lawrence. You're a good girl, and I know you don't want to ruin Lawrence and Miranda's relationship. But what's done is done. Miranda can't tolerate even the smallest blemish on their relationship. They have no future. But you and Lawrence, you still have endless possibilities. Don't you want to give it a try?" There was a time, though fleeting, when Julia almost surrendered to temptation. When Lawrence's grandmother gently offered her a way out, painting visions of a family and stability, Julia allowed herself for a brief moment to consider it. But fate was quicker than her hesitation. The pregnancy arrived without warning, a storm impossible to hide or delay. From that moment, every door she could have escaped through slammed shut. She was trapped in a marriage built on obligation and shame. And so, she endured. She endured Lawrence's cold stares, the Jiang family's veiled disdain, Miranda's sharp mocking smiles that felt like daggers slicing through her every time they met. Julia wore her masks carefully, sweet in front of the elders, distant before Lawrence, while inside her, the wounds deepened with every passing day. The sickness was unbearable, her body heavy and swollen with pain. The cramps bent her over as if her insides were twisting in rebellion against her own life. She carried the hatred directed at her for sins she never committed. She bore all the consequences, though she had never been at fault. Yet, she endured through it all. On her next birthday, her grandmother beamed with joy, preparing gifts for Julia and the unborn child. "I won't leave this time," she had said, smiling brightly. "I'll stay until my great-grandson is born and you've recovered." But life was never so kind. On that very birthday, while out for dinner, her grandmother saw Lawrence and Miranda kissing, hands intertwined like lovers with no shame. Her chest clenched, and she collapsed instantly. That was when Julia's resentment began to bloom, fierce and suffocating. She had not sinned, yet she was the one crushed under the weight of guilt and consequence. As her grandmother was rushed into emergency care, the Jiang family arrived at the hospital. Lawrence's grandmother, trembling with fury, slapped him across the face. Julia stood still, empty and hollow, eyes locked on the closed doors of the operating room, whispering desperate prayers for a miracle. But reality struck, cruel and swift. The doctor appeared, his face grim, telling her to say her goodbyes. How absurd that sounded. Only an hour before, her grandmother was holding her hand, speaking softly about the tiny baby clothes she had sewn. Now she was being asked to let go. Lawrence's grandmother wept beside her, apologizing endlessly, but Julia heard nothing. Her world collapsed around her as she clutched her grandmother's weakening hand, terrified that releasing it would make her loss permanent. In her final moments, her grandmother whispered, her voice weak but filled with pain. "I know you're not happy, you just don't want me to worry. But Julia, what will you do if no one treats you well? Who will take care of you when I'm gone?" Lawrence's grandmother gripped Julia's hand, pulling Lawrence closer, vowing through tears, "Don't worry, dear sister, I'll take good care of Julia." Lawrence knelt, his voice breaking as he echoed the promise, "Don't worry, Grandma, I'll take care of her." But even in her fading breath, Julia's grandmother smiled bitterly. "The greatest regret of my life was entrusting her family with my Julia." And then she slipped away. Julia's stomach twisted violently as labor seized her body. Amidst her grief and collapse, she was rushed into the delivery room, screaming through the long, merciless night until Benjamin was born. After her grandmother's death, Lawrence, perhaps guilt-stricken, distanced himself from Miranda. He rarely visited her, instead helping with the baby as they lived like strangers under one roof, raising a child neither truly understood. Miranda, broken-hearted, fled abroad, and for a while, Julia lived inside the illusion of peace, one that shattered when Miranda returned and reclaimed every ounce of affection that might have been hers. On Benjamin's birthday, Miranda planned a lavish surprise. Benjamin eagerly ran to her, abandoning Julia without a second thought. Lawrence told Julia Miranda still didn't want her there, so he took Benjamin alone, promising to return by dusk to celebrate Julia's birthday. But night fell, midnight passed, and they never returned. Lawrence's voice was calm when he finally called. Benjamin was tired from playing. He fell asleep. We stayed out. Julia sat by the window for hours, unmoving. Her grandmother's final words haunted her as the hours slipped by. "Grandma, I don't like birthdays anymore." And now, as Lawrence stood once again in her courtyard, Julia's walls were higher than ever. She let them in out of courtesy, offering water. Feli, always watchful, pulled out the calendar and pointed firmly at the red circle. "This is Mommy's birthday." Benjamin shifted anxiously, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. Father and son, identical not only in appearance, but in their inability to say the words that mattered. It was as if she had merely lent her body to bring Benjamin into the world, leaving no part of herself within him. Lawrence stacked the gift bags neatly, attempting to soften the tension. "It was my mistake this time. Next time, there won't be a next time," Julia cut in, her voice cool and resolute. "No need to prepare anything next time. No need to come." His back stiffened. After a long silence, he finally whispered, "I'm sorry. Can we talk privately?" She silently prepared drinks for the children, turned the TV to the children's channel, and led Lawrence into the courtyard pavilion beneath the fading light. "This place is beautiful," he remarked awkwardly. "Thanks for the compliment," Julia replied, her tone sharp and steady. "Say what you need to say." Lawrence shifted, struggling to maintain composure. "I noticed you're alone. If you don't mind, maybe we could remarry." Julia stared at him, without flinching. Lawrence averted his eyes, fumbling like a guilty child. "It's just for Benjamin. He deserves a complete family. He's not as spoiled anymore. He's changed." Her gaze narrowed, every word slicing deeper than the last. "Aren't you married to Miss Miranda?" Lawrence hesitated, his confidence evaporating. "Back then, everyone said she was right for me. You never argued, so I assumed you agreed. I thought you stepped aside, willingly. But it didn't work out." Julia's cold stare pinned him down as his hands clenched and trembled. "That's the past," he said weakly. "And so are we." Her voice was like steel wrapped in silk. "Yes, we have a child together. But so what? Stop hiding behind others, first Miranda, now Benjamin. Admit it, Lawrence. You never loved me." For so long, Julia used to wonder just how insignificant she must have been in Lawrence's eyes, that even admitting he once loved her was something he couldn't bring himself to say. Love was supposed to be hard to hide. She never confessed her love for Lawrence aloud, but her flushed cheeks and pounding heart had already betrayed her long ago. Their marriage had lasted 4 years. She always had a tendency to please others, but if Lawrence had never given her even a flicker of hope, she wouldn't have survived those years. She didn't know when he had begun to like her, or how much he ever truly cared. She simply inherited her grandmother's quiet persistence when something was broken. You didn't throw it away, you fixed it, you patched it, you tried to make it last. And she applied that same devotion to her marriage. She once believed that maybe Lawrence didn't completely despise her. If she tried a little harder, perhaps their marriage could become something real. She desperately searched for tiny traces of his affection, collecting fragile pieces of warmth that she hoped would light the way forward. And in the end, she did light a path, but it was jagged, cold, full of cracks and stench, leading not to happiness, but to deeper heartbreak. Those fragments of love were never enough to warm her. They only reminded her how suffocating this marriage had always been. Her voice softened, yet it sliced sharply through Lawrence's chest. "I used to think maybe you had some twisted sense of morality that wouldn't allow you to love anyone besides Miranda. But later I realized if you were truly that moral, how could you still maintain such ambiguous ties with your first love after marrying me? You're not noble, Lawrence. You're just selfish. You're still using Benjamin's longing for me as an excuse to return here." "But Lawrence, we've been divorced for 4 years." Lawrence swallowed hard, his voice hoarse and dry. "So, I'm too late, aren't I?" Julia let out a faint sigh, her expression neither bitter nor angry, only calm. It's not that you're too late. It's simply that everything is over. She whispered again more softly. Lawrence looked forward. He raised his trembling hand, covering his eyes, his pride crumbling as his shoulders shook. But seeing him broken like this brought Julia no comfort. Quietly, she stood and turned to leave. But just as she stepped away, she felt him grab her skirt, his knuckles pale and strained, his fingers digging in as though desperate to keep her from vanishing. His thin frame trembled, his voice muffled in sobs. Julia stood there, feeling the heaviness of it all, but she knew her decision was unshakable. "Don't come back anymore," she said softly. "Go back to your life. Take Benjamin with you." She gently freed her skirt from his grasp, smoothing out the fabric as though straightening the wrinkles of the past. "I forgot to tell you," she added with a faint smile, "my birthday is now the anniversary of our divorce. That was also the day I met Feli. Since I never knew her real birthday, we chose that day together our rebirth day. Consider this my early birthday present. Give me peace, Lawrence." "Thank you." Lawrence said nothing. His fingers slipped away like a drowning man finally losing his grip. Lawrence left, taking Benjamin with him. Though he stayed silent, Benjamin understood what was happening. Right before they were about to leave, Benjamin clung to Julia's leg with everything he had, sobbing uncontrollably. His small hands latched on, his body trembling as he cried until his voice broke. "I'm not leaving. I don't want to go. I want my mom. Please don't send me away, Mommy. I'll be good, I promise. I won't make you sad anymore. Please don't abandon me." His hoarse voice turned desperate as he screamed at Lawrence. "Daddy, you're a liar. You promised Mommy would forgive me. You're a liar. A villain. Go away." His cries echoed in the courtyard, cutting like knives into the evening air. "Mommy, Mommy." The car door slammed shut as Lawrence pulled the boy into the vehicle. Benjamin pounded on the window, tears streaming down his face as he stared at Julia with pleading, desperate eyes. Lawrence held him tightly, whispering to the driver, "Drive." He never looked back, not even once. Feli stood quietly beside Julia, her small hand reaching up to touch her mother's sleeve. "What's wrong?" Julia asked gently, glancing down at her daughter. "They won't come back, right?" Feli's voice was calm, but full of hope.
"No," Julia answered softly.
"They won't come back." "Mommy, are you sad?" Julia smiled faintly, brushing Feli's hair back with tenderness. "Feli, everything passes. No matter how painful things feel, if you keep moving forward and never look back, you'll eventually get through it." Julia had already walked far ahead on that lonely road, while Lawrence and Benjamin still stood trapped in the same place. But it no longer mattered. They were never meant to walk the same path. There was no reason for her to stop and wait anymore. That night, Julia had a dream. In it, she returned to the years when Benjamin was just born. Exhausted from caring for him, she had fallen asleep on the couch. In her half-conscious haze, it was Lawrence who came home late from work, silently picking her up and carrying her upstairs. He laid her on the bed gently, brushing the hair from her forehead before placing a light kiss there. "Good night, darling," he whispered softly. In that moment, Julia had truly believed she could spend a lifetime with him. But as the years passed, she came to understand that a lifetime was far too long, and that no one could truly walk alongside another forever. Lawrence had simply been a fleeting passenger in her life, a bright, sharp stroke on the canvas of her existence, but nothing more. "Lawrence, you and I ended long ago." After the divorce, the Jiang household was filled with an odd, heavy silence. The woman whom everyone had resented was finally gone, but instead of relief, the house felt hollow. Lawrence, always quiet, spoke even less now. His days blurred into endless business trips and work obligations. Even when he returned home, he would fall asleep the moment his head hit the pillow. Benjamin, though still young, wandered the large villa like a restless shadow. He threw tantrums, played with the nanny, and for a while, seemed perfectly unaffected. But one day, without warning, he asked, "Where's Mommy?" The nanny froze, not knowing what to say. Benjamin, undeterred, began to search the house under the table, in the closet, in every corner of the vast estate. "Where's Mommy hiding?" he mumbled. Children forget easily, but Benjamin was sharp. He remembered clearly the morning his mother had left. That morning, Julia had knelt before him, smiling softly as she patted his head. "Ben, Mommy's leaving. I used to hope you'd grow up to be a good, obedient boy, but now I understand that you're different from me. You have the privilege to be willful. In the days ahead, I hope you can be happy and carefree." Back then, Benjamin hadn't understood her words. He had simply been annoyed at her constant scolding and restrictions. But now, standing alone in the enormous, cold house, those words echoed inside him like a hollow wind. And for the first time, Benjamin felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before: sadness. That night, when Lawrence returned home, Benjamin did something unexpected. He took his father's hand gently and looked up with pleading eyes. "Daddy, did you fight with Mommy?" Lawrence paused, staring down at his son's innocent face as it frowned with confusion. "Can you apologize to Mommy?"
Can you make up?
"I haven't seen her in so long. I want to eat Mommy's sweet and sour ribs. Can we eat them tonight?" Lawrence's expression was blank at first, then slowly twisted into something darker, almost cruel. His lips curled into a cold smile as he bent down to Benjamin's level. "I didn't fight with her. I divorced her. Do you know what divorce means?" Benjamin blinked, clearly startled. Lawrence's voice grew colder. "Divorce means she doesn't want you anymore. She won't see you anymore. No matter what you want, she won't care. She abandoned you, Benjamin. Do you understand?" Lawrence seemed to savor the fear that began to spread across Benjamin's small face. His voice dropped even lower, almost hissing. "She doesn't want you anymore. She'll have other children, better ones, more obedient, more lovable than you. You mean nothing to her now." Benjamin's face turned pale, his small body shaking as his voice cracked into a scream. "You're lying. Mommy would never abandon me. You're the one she left. Mommy said she loved me the most." "She lied to you," Lawrence sneered. "You were fooled. She loved you the most?"
Ha!
"You actually believed that?" "Lawrence, what are you saying to the child?" The Jiang family elders hurried over, pulling Benjamin into their arms, trying to calm his hysteria. "Ben, don't cry. Daddy's just joking with you." "I want Mommy," Benjamin wailed. "Mommy's busy, sweetie. She went to her hometown. She'll be back soon, okay?"
No.
"I want to see her now." Benjamin thrashed violently, screaming through sobs, while Lawrence stood aside, his face blank, watching his son's emotional collapse with complete indifference. Even as Benjamin cried so hard he nearly vomited, Lawrence simply frowned slightly and turned to walk upstairs. The bedroom looked exactly as it had the day Julia left, the large wedding photo still hanging on the wall. Sometimes, Lawrence didn't even understand his own thoughts. When he broke up with Miranda, he had deleted her number, blocked her contacts, discarded every trace of her existence like burning away a bad memory. But with Julia, he couldn't throw anything away. As if discarding their shared belongings meant admitting defeat, meant accepting that Julia was gone. He tried to hold his emotions steady, tried to convince himself that her departure hadn't affected him. After all, she was just a woman he didn't love. The divorce was supposed to be his relief. Half a year after the divorce, Miranda had once asked him directly, "Do you want to get married?" Lawrence was silent for a moment before replying, "Forget it." Benjamin's still fussing over Julia. "If I marry you, he'll throw a tantrum." Miranda stared into his eyes and asked, "Is it really because of Benjamin? Or is it because of you?" Lawrence frowned. "What else would it be?" Miranda laughed bitterly. "Lawrence, you even lied to yourself. That's what I admire most about you." Lawrence didn't know what he was lying to himself about. Years later, when Benjamin turned 18, Lawrence was still alone, while Julia had quietly remarried. Her new husband was a gentle, slightly shy programmer who adored her and, out of love for her, treated Benjamin with genuine kindness as well. On Julia's wedding day, Benjamin attended the ceremony. That evening over dinner, He casually mentioned to Lawrence that it had been a pleasant event, small but lively. Lawrence simply chewed his food in silence, not even glancing at him. That was how their relationship had always been, distant, cold, and polite, as was typical in wealthy families where emotions were a silent currency never exchanged. What Benjamin didn't know was that Lawrence had attended the wedding too. He had stood at a distance, quietly placing a red envelope containing a bank card on the gift table. Julia had refused to accept it.
Take it, Lawrence had said.
I know you don't need this, but it's all I can give. I have nothing else for you. Julia had smiled softly, shaking her head. You don't need to give me anything. She wore a simple gown, far less elaborate than the one she wore at their own wedding, but the smile on her face was more genuine than he had ever seen. Lawrence dared only to glance at her once before looking away, afraid that if he lingered, he might lose control, fall to his knees, and beg her not to marry, not to leave him again. The bridal room was quiet. A staff member knocked gently. Is the bride ready? It's time. Yes, ready, Julia replied, standing gracefully. Before she left, she turned to Lawrence and offered kindly, Ben is outside. Why don't you stay a little longer and eat something before you go? No, Lawrence shook his head, stepping toward the door. With his hand on the doorknob, he suddenly spoke without turning around. By the way, there's something I've never told you. Julia tilted her head, curious. I used to be jealous of Benjamin and your grandmother. Julia's eyes widened slightly. What did you say? Everyone always said you loved me deeply. But I always felt like your grandmother came first. And when Benjamin was born, every time he cried, it was like I ceased to exist for you. I resented that. Subconsciously, I wanted all of your attention for myself. Lawrence let out a hollow, self-deprecating laugh. What a pity. I wasn't so lucky. And I lost even what I originally had. I wasn't drunk that night, Julia. I was completely aware. Finally, Lawrence turned around and looked at her, his eyes heavy with regret. If you're ever unhappy in the future, you can come find me. But if you're happy, please don't tell me. You know I'm not a good person. Seeing you happy without me would only make me want to destroy it. From the first moment the programmer appeared by Julia's side, Lawrence had known. That ugly, destructive desire had risen instantly from the shadows inside him, wanting to ruin her second chance at happiness. But when he saw Julia's smile that day so pure, so radiant, finally understood. Not attending her wedding had been his last act of mercy. Yes, it was sad. Yes, it was regrettable. But no matter how much sadness and regret remained, in this lifetime, he and Julia were over. Lawrence thought back to the year he first met Julia. He hadn't wanted to pick up the country girl his grandmother sent. A second before seeing her, he was still complaining on the phone to his friends. But then he looked up and saw her. And in that instant, it was as if all the summer heat disappeared, leaving only cicadas humming and sunlight filtering through the trees. His breath caught. The attraction was immediate, instinctive. He had done many things since that moment that even he could no longer explain. His eyes followed her every move, unconsciously drawn to her quiet grace. By the time he realized, it was already too late. He watched the sunlight in her dim, watched the shadows swallow her light. And for a long time, he truly believed she would always stay. In a daze, Lawrence slipped into a dream. In that dream, it was their wedding day again. The officiant's voice rang out, holding the microphone. In sickness and in health, in wealth and in poverty, Mr. Lawrence, do you take Miss Julia as your wife? And he heard his own voice respond. I do.